So in this video, we're going to look at truthy and falsy values. This is something for you it's really important for you to understand. So try and remember these, at least the falsy values, because anything that is not falsy is going to be truthy. And what I mean by that is if you have something you pass into an if statement that's not something equal to or is something greater than, maybe you just have a string like an email. So we'll say test@test.com, and then I pass that in here. So I want to evaluate email, and then I'll just console log here, you passed in an email. And if I save that, you'll see that that runs. So this was evaluated to true, or I should say coerced to true. If you remember, we talked about type coercion, where JavaScript implicitly changes the type. So when you pass something into an if statement, it's always going to be coerced into a Boolean. Okay, and we can even do a console log here and say Boolean and pass in email, and you'll see we get true. The reason for this is that a string with anything in it is a truthy value. Okay, so it's always going to result to true. So what I want to do is paste in, we'll do the falsy values first. So let's, we can just get rid of this. And I'm going to paste these in. So there's 6 falsy values. And what I'm going to do is set a variable, let's say const x, and I'm going to set it to the first one, which is false. And I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to pass it into Boolean to see what it evaluates to. And then I'm going to, I'm sorry, that should be x. And then I'm going to do an if statement. So I'll say if x, and then we'll say console log this is, we'll say this is truthy if this is true, right? And then let's say else, then we'll console log this is falsy. If I save that, we're going to get this is falsy and false, because obviously false, which is already a Boolean, is going to be a Boolean false. Now 0, if I pass in 0 to x, we get the same result, because if we pass 0 into an if statement, that's a falsy value, so we're going to get false for that. If we pass in an empty string, that's also a falsy value. That's why a lot of times, like with web forms, when you're doing validation, you'll check to see if the value is there or not. So it's passed in as an empty string if it's submitted as an empty web form or an empty input. All right, so an empty string, null, is also going to be falsy. Undefined is going to be falsy, and then nan, or not a number, is also going to be falsy. Now, anything that is not falsy is going to be truthy. So anything other than these 6 values right here. But there are some things that are a little confusing that you might think are falsy, and even developers after like a year still forget that these are falsy, some of these. So I'm going to paste in some of these truthy values. Like I said, everything else is not falsy, but let's try some of these. So obviously true is going to be truthy, right? If we do 0 but within a string, of course that's truthy. Anything in a string is truthy, even a space. If I put a space here, that's truthy. But if it has nothing, then that's going to be falsy. All right, if I put false in a string, that's truthy, because that's not an actual Boolean. It's a string with something in it. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as it's something. Another thing that can be confusing is an empty array. If I do that, that's truthy. You might think if we say if and then an empty array, you might think that that's going to be falsy because there's nothing in it, but it's still an array. If you want to get the length, if you want to check to see if there's something in an array, then you want to check the length. Same thing goes with objects. If we have just an empty object, that's also truthy. If we have a function that has nothing in it, that's going to be truthy as well. So this is really important for you to remember, that it's going to be true unless it's one of these things right here. Now let's talk about some caveats. So I'm going to say truthy and falsy caveats. I was going to do this in a separate video, but we're only at 4 minutes and something. So let's say let's say we have a web form that's asking how many children we have, and I'll create a variable to represent that. So I'll say const children equals 2. Let's say that's what we passed in. And then we want to validate the form, so we're saying if children, then we'll do something. Let's just say a console log with backticks, and we'll say you have whatever number children, and then else, then we want to tell them to enter their children, right? The number of children. So we'll console log and say, please enter number of children. Okay. And this is something you commonly see in web forms if a field is required. So I'm going to save that. We get you have 2 children, right? They passed in 2. Pass in 1, you have 1 children. Now, what do you think is going to happen if we have no children and we choose 0? Let's say it's a select field and we select 0. Well, it says, please enter number of children. Well, I have no children, so I'm selecting 0. The reason it's doing this is because 0 is being evaluated here, and 0 is a falsy value. So you can run into some issues with this. I've actually seen this same issue over and over. So a solution here, one thing you could do is say, is children not equal to undefined? If I do that, now it says you have 0 children. Another thing I could do is run children through not is nan. So is nan is not a number. And what I'm saying here is it not a number? If I save that, that works as well. You have 0 children. If I put in 3, that's going to work as well. So that's another solution you could do. But yeah, you just want to make sure you know whatever you're passing in, make sure you know what that coerces or what that evaluates to. Now, another caveat that we see is checking for empty arrays. So maybe you have an array of blog posts, and if there are no posts, you want to say like no post to show or something like that. So let me just show you. If we do const, we'll just call this posts, and we'll set that to an array, and we'll say post 1 and post 2, right? And then we'll console log, we want to do an if statement. So if we say if posts, then I'm just going to console log here list posts, else then we'll console log no posts. If I save that, it says list posts. So I mean, in real life you'd probably list your posts in the DOM, which we're going to get to soon. But if you have no posts and save, it still says list posts. It doesn't say no posts. Or we'll say no posts to list. It doesn't say that because an empty array is truthy, right? If we go up here, an empty array is a truthy value. So that's going to evaluate to true. So again, know what you're passing in. So what you could do here, remember we have a length property on arrays. You can see that the length is 0. If I add something in here, then it's 1, okay? 1, 2, whatever, however many is in there. So what you could do is say if post.length is greater than 0. Now if I do that, it says no post to lists. If I go in there and I add in post 1 and save, now we get list posts. So if you want to check for an empty array, you want to do it like this. Now with objects, let's say checking for empty objects. So we'll say const and I don't know, we'll just say user equals, and let's set it to say name and Brad. And then we want to check, say if user, then console log, and we'll just say list user, else, then we'll console log no user. All right, so if I save that, we're going to get list user. Now if I empty the properties and it's just an empty object, it also says list user. So you might want to check to see if there's anything in the object, and doing it like this is not going to work because this is a truthy value. Now we can't use length directly on an object. So if I were to try to console log user.length, you can see it gives me undefined. So we can't use length. What you would do, I mean, there's a few ways you could do this, but one of the most common things to do is to use object.keys, and we looked at this in a past section. If we say object.keys and we pass in our user, that will give us an array of the keys, right? So then, since that's an array, then we can call length on it. And we can say if that is greater than 0. Or you might want to say if it's equal to 0, then you would do this. You know, you might do it the opposite way around. So let's save that, and now we get no user if there's nothing in here. If I add in a name and save, now it says list user. Now another thing that can be confusing is using loose equality, which is the double equal sign. And this is one of the reasons that I just about always use a triple equal sign. So if we were to do a console log and say false double equals 0, okay, so we're comparing false to 0 and we're getting true. And the reason for that is because 0 is a falsy value, and obviously so is false. So if I were to do, let's say, an empty string equals 0, again, I get true. If I do null equal to undefined, I get true. So there's many cases if you're trying to compare these, you're not going to want true. So that's where the strict equality comes in. If we add another equal sign to all of these, oops, then we're going to get false for all of them, because this will check the type as well. Okay, so again, I always use triple equals, but everyone has their own preference. So those are some of the caveats that you might run into when you're dealing with truthy and false values. I don't know if caveat's the right word, but some areas of confusion. So hopefully that clears that confusion up.